if the Soviet Union won the Cold War? How would our everyday lives, the economy, and so much more change? This video was heavily inspired by Possible History's video on what if the Soviet Union won the Cold War and the scenario written by Serov. A Cold War is a state of conflict between nations that does not involve direct military action, but is pursued primarily through economic and political actions, propaganda, acts of espionage, or proxy wars waged by surrogates. This term is most commonly used to refer to the American-Soviet Cold War of 1947-1989. As we all know, the USA won the Cold War and the Soviet Union broke up into multiple states, with all of them transitioning from communism to capitalism. But how exactly could the Soviet Union win the Cold War? The short answer: it could not. Due to the economic and political problems that plagued the Soviet Union, the many casualties of both world wars and the Civil War, a very bloody reconstruction of the Russian economy, it is fair to say that a lot of things need to change if we want the Soviets to win the Cold War. Because of their start, they were simply doomed from the beginning. And so if we want a Soviet victory of the Cold War, we need to go back, way back to the very start of communist rule in Russia, the October Revolution. It is the middle of World War I, and Russia suffered massive casualties from the war, and the people want peace. Vladimir Lenin and his party took control over the Russian government, and as he did, it fell upon him to make peace with the German Empire and get the country out of World War I. Now, what was a major mistake that the communists made during this time? Delaying the Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations. Trotsky, the leader of the delegation, hoped that there would be communist revolutions taking place in Germany and Austria as well, so he adopted a policy of stop the war, do not sign the peace. This failed in our timeline, and when the Germans figured out that the Russians were just wasting their time, they launched a new offensive, which made Russia lose the Baltic countries, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and pay extreme war reparations to the Germans. This was disastrous for the new republic, as it just lost a third of its population and half of its industrial land. So to avoid this situation, let's say that Lenin, who actually wanted to sign the peace treaty as soon as possible, goes personally to Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations and ends the war, with Russia giving monetary and agricultural reparations, as well as the Baltic states, Poland, and parts of Belarus as territorial compensations to the Germans. But nevertheless, it is a much more tame version of what happened in our timeline. The civil war in Russia still erupts, but with some different decisions. This war will be less bloody and over in a much shorter time frame. First of all, the Soviets in our timeline managed to capture the commander of the Southern White Army, but they let him go. So in this timeline, instead of letting him go, they outright execute him, leading to a quicker collapse of the Southern Front, allowing the Soviets to focus on fighting the remnants of the White Army in Siberia, thus finishing the Russian Civil War quicker and with less casualties. The Polish-Soviet War still starts, but with more troops for the Russians, the Baltic states don't stand a chance and fall. Even with more troops, the Bolsheviks still can't conquer Warsaw, but manage to win the war with more territories than what happened in reality. Following the end of the wars, the Soviet Union is still in a bad shape, but much better than the one in our timeline. And since the wars are over quicker, this means the collectivization and industrialization programs would happen earlier, with a bigger population, which would lead to a more prosperous Soviet Union. In our timeline, before Lenin died, he managed to name Trotsky as his successor and heir of the Soviet Union, and even though Trotsky didn't become the leader of the country, it led to Stalin enacting the Great Purge, and killing around 1 million people and various important and skilled people such as marshals, commanders, scientists, factory managers, engineers, wealthy farmers, and so much more, because he was afraid of a revolution that would overthrow him to make Trotsky the new leader. But let's say that Lenin somehow chooses Stalin as his heir and the next leader of the Soviet Union. This would give his rule legitimacy. It might lead him to not enact the Great Purge, or not to the scale it happened in our timeline. What does this mean? Well, besides 1 million people not dying, it also means much of the experienced Soviet high command doesn't die during the purges and can fight in World War II, increasing the power of the Soviet Union massively. World War II still plays out like it did in our timeline, but the Germans start losing much earlier, and the Soviets manage to push past Berlin towards the Rhine before meeting the Allied troops. In Asia, the Japanese still lose the war, and the Soviets manage to conquer the entire Korean peninsula and influence communist China to such a degree that instead of Mao Zedong rising to power, the pro-Soviet Wang Ming becomes the chairman of the People's Republic of China. With the Second World War over, this Europe looks a tad bit different than what we usually know. On one hand, East Germany has almost the entirety of German lands, and Yugoslavia and Greece are both Soviet puppet states. And East Asia is mostly controlled by the communists, with the only exception being Japan. With Stalin getting older, it is now time for him to choose a successor, and that successor is Malenkov. With Stalin being seen as a more competent ruler in this timeline, Nikita Khrushchev doesn't depose Malenkov in this timeline. This means that Khrushchev's rushed liberalization doesn't cause discontent across the Soviet Union. At the same time, Malenkov sought to focus more on the civilian industry rather than the military one, and reduce the bureaucracy in the country. So we would see a domestically stronger Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the space race still starts and goes the same way as it did in our timeline, apart from the finale. With the Soviets capturing Werner von Braun from the Nazis, they are further ahead in rocketry technology and thus reach the moon first, further demoralizing the US. The economy of the USSR is doing better, but it contains a bunch of fundamental flaws. There are two proposals to solve this: decentralization or automatization. In our timeline, the Soviet Union attempted decentralization, which led to richer citizens, but this also resulted in those richer citizens demanding better goods and causing discontent. For this timeline, let's say Malenkov chooses automation. Unifying all the Union's computing systems into one network greatly increases the efficiency and productivity of the Soviet economy. During the 70s, Malenkov would step down, leaving Alexander Shelepin as the new leader of the Soviet Union. He would try to spread communism further, while at the same time try to reform his country for the better by getting rid of corruption. The USA still loses the Vietnam War, as all of Indochina falls to the communist ideology. And as the United States will find out soon, not even its backyard is safe as Cuba, Peru, and Chile fall to communist regimes. Meanwhile, in the other part of the world, Shelepin managed to create a military and financial alliance, including all communist states from Germany to Korea. While the US on its own is more powerful than the Soviets, the USSR is increasingly expanding, its influence all over the globe. This leads to the US electing Reagan as the president who promises to save the economy. But before he manages to do that, he gets assassinated. George Bush then becomes president, and while the country is still in shock from a president being assassinated, doesn't manage to implement the necessary economic reforms that were promised by Reagan. The turmoil in the USA would be unprecedented, but then the most important moment in the Cold War would arrive. The government of Mexico would be overthrown and replaced by a communist regime. The USA simply wouldn't accept this and would invade it. Although they would quickly win the conventional war, but then Mexico turns into this world's version of our Afghanistan. With the collapse of international NATO power, we would see a French election with a left-wing coalition victory, meaning French withdrawal from the organization. With France no longer in NATO, the Western-aligned rump state in Germany would become unholdable, leading to German unification. This would be seen as the loss of American influence on mainland Europe, another devastating hit to the US morale. Thanks to the investment into the automatized economy, the Soviets quickly exploit the concept of the modern internet. OGAs would soon be expanded beyond just Russia, connecting Eastern Europe and China to the system as well. By the late 1990s, the Soviets are by far the dominant world power, forcing the world to start trading in the Soviet currency. as the OGAS system improves the competitiveness of the Soviet industry and technology. It's even looking like the Russian economy may soon overtake the US as the largest single nation on Earth. In 2008, we find the US in a pretty bad shape. The government is increasingly authoritarian, and the people distrust its capacity to govern. It would all come to a head when the 2008 elections would come, and reports of voter fraud appeared. All hell would break loose. Everywhere across the country, massive riots would start appearing, and not soon after we would see the first states seceding. Texas and surrounding states declare independence. A communist West Coast sponsored by the Chinese and Soviets appears, with the US keeping control of the East Coast by calling back its troops from Mexico. The USSR stands as the sole ruler of the world, but not everything is perfect. With the USA out of the picture, China becomes increasingly independent from the communist bloc, and Germany starts influencing the other European nations, bringing them towards its sphere. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Maybe we can reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. Also, make sure to check Serov's original document and Possible History's original video for a more in detail experience. Thank you for watching and have a good day.